Some people, I'm going to use a Yiddish expression, shepnaches, that means they get pride from their children, and some from their grandchildren or their cousins. But how many can shepnaches from their mother? As a small child, I was unaware that my mother was special. It was only later that I learned how very talented and accomplished she was. As a young woman graduating from high school, a rarity in the early days of the 20th century, my mother decided to become a serious writer. She was encouraged by her professors at Columbia and NYU, where she had studied journalism. She was also especially encouraged by her father, who had come from a very cultured environment in Vilna, Lithuania. She quickly became a sensation in the family and in the town of Jersey City, where she was born in 1891, because one of her short stories was selected to be included in a collection of the best short stories of the year 1918. And shortly after, she had a one-act play produced in a Broadway theater for Fulton. My mother was a very beautiful woman and had many beaux and many marriage proposals, but she was never happy with any of them. Her writing was paramount, and being married would put an end to her career. Needless to say, her family was very unhappy with her lack of marriage plans, and I suppose they put a lot of pressure on her. When she met my father, who was determined to marry her, she was really torn with indecision. She tells this story. One night, her grandmother, Tzril, came to her in a dream and admonished her by saying, "Bessie, this is one you mustn't throw away." Well, that settled that, and my mother married my father, David Waldman, on October 30th, 1921. Predictably, her writing days became eclipsed by her marriage to my father and the birth of her 3 daughters. To quote my mother, everyday life became more interesting and more demanding than her literary career. And so it was. For many years, Mother was busy with Hadassah, working to help my sisters and I through college and enjoying her grandchildren. Her writing consisted of plays for the family when someone had an anniversary, and plays for Hadassah and her synagogue's sisterhood. When my grandmother, Hinda, became very ill in 1948, she came to stay with my mother, and it was at this time she made her daughter Bessie, my mother, promise to write her story. My mother asked, "Where do I begin?" My grandmother Hinda answered, "Start at the beginning. Start with Tzril." This is the story of the book of Tzril. The book of Tzril, and maybe you have a copy of it here, by Bess Waldman, is the story of one woman, Tzril, and her search for her origin, her past, her family, her roots. Yes, what Alex Haley did for the blacks in the 1960s, Tzril did for our family 100 years earlier. This fascinating story begins about the year 1830. Cyril's father, Zalman Yitzchak Gordon, a vintner, a Turkish Jew from Tiflis, that was at that time, Turkey, has had his land confiscated due to the defeat of the Turkish Empire by Russia in one of the many wars fought at this time. Since no Jew in Russia is allowed to own land and must live within the pale of settlement, Zalman Yitzchak, his wife Zipporah, his 4 sons, and a daughter, Bela, the grandmother was named after her, became part of a large group of Sephardic Jews who are forced to march over 1,000 miles to the north of Russia and are settled in the Vilna, that's in Lithuania, and other nearby towns in the Pale of Settlement. By the time Zalman Yitzchak arrives in Vilna, only Bela, his little 7-year-old daughter, survives. His wife Zipporah has succumbed. His 2 oldest sons are conscripted into the army, and the 2 younger boys have disappeared. Zalman never sees his sons again. Zalman, a gifted musician, earns his living as a violinist and becomes well known to the Jewish community in Vilna. He was known as Tzril Pt1. Zalman eventually marries Devera, the daughter of one of Zalman's friends, who was also a displaced Jew from Turkey. Okay. Zalman's main goal in life is to reclaim his land in the south of Russia, the Kafkaz, and to this end he has documents and is only waiting for his case to be scheduled at the courts of St. Petersburg. By now, Bela, his daughter, is married and has returned to the south of Russia to Tiflis with her husband, a printer, who has received special permission to return to this part of Russia, which was once part of Turkey, as the Russian authorities have special need for his talents. After many years of waiting, the case of Zalman Yitzchak Gordon versus the Russian Empire comes to trial. However, after 7 years of endless litigation, Zalman dies, and by now has 2 daughters, Hannah and Tzril, vows to carry on the fight. Devera leaves the children with a friend and moves to St. Petersburg, where the trial is being held. When she returns 3 years later, her health is gone and she has lost the case. By now, she is penniless. She writes a desperate letter to her stepdaughter Bela, asking for help, and then Devera dies, leaving the 2 girls the orphans. Because of the long periods of time without parental companionship, both sisters know of no other family members and do not know of the history of the family. In fact, they do not even know the names of their parents. Fortunately, the Jewish community stepped in to help the 2 orphans. Hannah, who is very beautiful by now, almost 16 years old, and Tzril is 8. Much to the sorrow of Hannah, the Jewish community decides decides the best thing for the girls was to get Hannah married, and the sister will go to live with her. The community arranged a marriage for Hannah with a young widower, Yosef Rosenblum, who has 2 young sons and whose wife has died in childbirth. Hannah's new life begins with her marriage to Yosef, and she takes her little sister Tzril to live with her in Kovna. Eventually, Hannah has a large brood of children, and Tzril grows up practically a servant in her sister's house. She's a most unhappy person, and as you read this book, you realize she is also very unusual, very religious, very demanding, always complaining, and always asking Hannah for memories of her parents, their names, and so forth. Hannah maintained she knows nothing. Tzril finally meets a young man, Yosef, a relative of Hannah's husband, Yosef, who falls in love with her, and almost 20 years after she leaves Vilna, Tzril gets married and moves to Vilki, a nearby village, a shtetl. Her husband's name is Yosel Dilkamirski. He took the name, their last name was from the town that they lived in. Shortly after Tzril's marriage, an emissary arrives at Hannah's home from the great Yitzchak Elchanan Yeshiva in Chavno. This yeshiva was famous for locating and reuniting families that have been separated by the shifting boundaries of the Pale of Settlement. This emissary, a noted rabbi, tells Hannah and Tzril that they had a half-sister, Bela, who had been searching for them for many years, and he produced voluminous correspondence to show them how they had finally tracked down Hannah and Tzril.